Hello everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Ernie Badway, and I am welcoming you to Thompson Hines's Investment Management Coffee Chat webinar series. This is our seventh session in this series, and we're delighted that you're here today with us. And we're hoping that you will enjoy this particular presentation of the series, but also our ongoing securities coffee chats, which are designed to provide concise, practical discussions on the latest hot topics and trends impacting the financial services industry. Today's session, which we really hope many will enjoy, is entitled Under the Microscope, Government Scrutiny and Investment Management. Despite what you may have read in the paper, the government has not closed up shop completely. They are continuing their scrutiny and also focusing in on the investment management industry among many firms across the spectrum who are feeling the impact. This heightened enforcement and different enforcement from prior administrations is evolving, and expectations around digital assets and private funds, the risks are real and growing. I am pleased today to introduce our amazing panel, my partners and colleagues. Let me first begin by introducing Brittain, who's a partner in our White Collar Defense and Investigations group, as well as Mark Cipolletti, who's also a partner in our White Collar Defense and Investigations group, and Ben Sandlin, who is a managing associate in the same group. We encourage everyone to participate by submitting your questions in the chat box throughout the program, and we'll address as many as possible during the session. And if we don't get to them, we promise we will follow up with you. Now, look, this discussion is really about general information for individuals and organizations. It's not legal advice, so we would suggest that participants not act on the information in this discussion, but if they want to speak about it and talk about it, to contact one of our panelists. Now, with that being said, let's get started. And Mark, I want to turn to you first of all, and can you give us a broad sort of idea of what's happening in the enforcement space in the financial services industry?
Yeah, sure. I think, and thanks, Ernie. I think most agencies that are regulating in this space, and that's the DOJ, the SEC, CFTC, FINRA, all of it. One of the goals here has been to try to make the rules cleaner, right? Make sure everybody knows what they can and can't do. And then when you're doing something that you can't do, expect a swift enforcement, quick enforcement, and maybe a sizable penalty or punishment. And the point here is that the agencies are, and seemingly well so far, working together rather than each trying to lay, stake their own claim to a certain industry, a certain sector, what have you. We saw a lot of that with the attempts at regulating crypto under the last administration. So there's this effort for everyone to be working together, and that does seem to be going well. Certainly with, people here, like, and you said it, Ernie, wow, there's just less government, less enforcement. That's not necessarily the case, right? You have an administration change, you have priorities change. With that, certainly they're doing things that you might do that are in line with that. They are getting rid of cases, dismissing cases that they don't necessarily think are appropriate, and also just trying to initiate the ones that they want. That is necessarily going to take some time. You wouldn't expect a new administration to walk in late January and then start seeing a flurry of cases in February or March, but you are. And I think, even by the time we got into September, we started seeing a lot of where these agencies are going, particularly in the financial enforcement space. The SEC, really ramped up there. So whatever, the idea that enforcement is gone is not the case. There's definitely no reason to be playing anything fast and loose. One thing that all of the regulators are focused on, particularly DOJ, and I can probably speak to that most intimately, having come from there after a decade or so, is compliance, right? In May, the DOJ reissued their compliance. I don't think the SEC, CFTC, FINRA have necessarily had to do that, but the DOJ has emphasized the need for compliance, the need for diligence, the need for self-reporting, if that's the right thing. That being said, self-reporting is not something that should be taken lightly, and you definitely need the advice of counsels and professionals in that field, because something that you might self-report or self-disclose to the SEC could easily be at the same time or shortly thereafter the subject of a criminal DOJ investigation, and vice versa. Something that you self-report to the department could also be being investigated by the SEC or CFTC. So those are things that folks need to consider. But really what we've seen here, I think SEC Chairman Atkins put well at least what the commission's agenda is, and that was hold accountable those who lie, cheat, and steal. So,
Mark, is there a recent case that we could point to, or some like recent sort of enforcement initiative announced either at the DOJ or SEC level that sort of like epitomizes what they seem to be doing?
So, well, certainly, and I think two big things that you saw out of the regulators. The SEC and CFTC have sort of announced this joint task force to work together. And Chairman Atkins doubled down on that in late September. That came out early. I think it was like September 5th that they announced it. In late September, Chairman Atkins doubled down on that and really sort of was using it as a clarifying example of this is what we're going to do. We're going to make sure that there's not regulatory overlap, but understand the rules are, again, going to be clearer, going to be cleaner. I think another thing that the SEC has done recently and the DOJ has done recently, which really go to point, a lot of what their efforts are aimed at, and a lot of what the administration's efforts are aimed at, are these creation of these cross-border task forces to combat fraud. DOJ calls it the Trade Crimes Task Force. SEC is calling it the I don't know. I think they're calling it the cross-border task force to combat fraud. And really, what the focus of that is to make sure that U.S. companies, the U.S. markets, and everyone else is playing on a level playing field. And the SEC's cross-border task force has been making efforts to investigate foreign companies that might have potential federal security law violations, such as market manipulation, pump and dump schemes. And I have a feeling we're going to talk about this later, because that return to the basics enforcement has been another thing that the SEC and other agencies have really been emphasizing lately, which is like, let's get back to the basics, understand what we're here. It's waste, it's fraud, it's abuse. It's, as Chairman Atkins says, lying, cheating, stealing. Those are always going to get you in trouble.
It's interesting, though, that with the new administration, they haven't really come up with any good names lately. They seem to be borrowing the same names with all. Thanks, Mark. And Brittain, in terms of what you're seeing, what do you think is getting the most attention from regulators? Like under the old administration, Mark mentioned, about like digital assets and things like that. Is there a particular in more than just like, lying, cheating, and stealing, but like, is there a particular area we should be looking at, like conflicts of interest or fees or custody or valuation or anything like that?
Sure. Great question, Ernie. So I think, the big picture macro wise, what they're looking at is what I view as back to the bread and butter of what the SEC, has always done, which is, schemes or conduct that directly harms, individual and potentially like vulnerable investors, whether it's the elderly investing their retirement funds and so forth. So any, again, insider trading is going to be big. Pump and dumps is going to be a big area of examination. And then in terms of, the crypto space, there's a backing off, but at the same time, I think the issue of custody around crypto is going to be a big one. And custody issues generally are going to continue to bear scrutiny. But again, any sort of scheme that touches on, that goes to the vulnerability of individual investors with information sharing. So conflicts of interest is obviously going to be a big one. Undisclosed ownership interests and manipulative trading certainly is going to be a big one, because those affect the market and reflect a larger sort of information disadvantage to the individual investor. I think we're going to see more of this, necessarily on the, FINRA will probably, seem more active than the SEC. Kind of as Mark said, the SEC is going to sort of revamp after kicking the tires of the cases they don't like. And so, I think that any of those sort of bread and butter issues that have always sort of borne the most fruit in terms of ferreting out the bad actors are going to continue to be front and center, and probably will get a little bit of a bump. Less sort of enforcement regulation and more true enforcement and the truly egregious conduct.
Do you think that the private equity space and the hedge fund space will see less of an effect than others? Do you think they're going to be, I don't want to say exempt, that may be too strong of the word.
I would think not necessarily, because, again, there's discussions about whether certain private equity investments are going to be made available for, 401ks and so forth. And again, like that is a whole fraught area, given the information disadvantage that an individual investor or even advisor may have vis-a-vis the private equity folks. So I don't think they're going to get a pass. And, in my experience, I mean, I spent, 2 decades at DOJ, the last, decade at the fraud section. And when I started at the fraud section, many of my cases involved, criminal investigation of private equity funds and hedge funds, and they were very much the bread and butter type of cases. It was, manipulative trading, Ponzi schemes, you name it. So I don't think they're going to escape scrutiny at all. I would expect them to potentially be, scrutinized. They've got to shift some attention away from, crypto got a lot of attention, and I think it still deserves it as a new space, but they need to come up with clear rules. But they already know what the clear rules are for, private equity and hedge funds. So that sort of goes back to classic SEC, FINRA, DOJ enforcement, which I would expect to be robust.
And do you also think too that are the SEC and FINRA, and also, like as Mark was mentioning, the SEC and CFTC, but do you think the SEC and FINRA are on the same page?
I think to some extent they're on the same page. They're always going to be on the same page. I think that, as I noted before, I think FINRA, given that the SEC now has greater controls within the commission in terms of, in order to initiate investigation, there's got to be commission approval for subpoenas. There's a lot more oversight that's going to happen. So you're going to see, I think, FINRA be able to sort of go into areas more granularly. So, for example, policing how third-party risk is being managed by, investment managers or brokers and dealers, whether that's your cybersecurity or, auditing and so forth. They can probably, move more swiftly, but I don't think they're going to be at all at odds. It just may be that one is able to be a little bit more nimble right now, anyway, given the shift, the somewhat dramatic shift in the SEC, sort of taking a breath on crypto and revisiting its core themes.
Well, one of the fascinating things that I find about what's been happening is all of the people, and it's sad because I know for you and for me, being a former SEC enforcement person, that you see friends who've been working there for years and are now no longer working there. What I find fascinating is both people at the Department of Justice and at the SEC have made sort of like comments about how they're going to have to start rehiring people if they're going to be able to continue with this enforcement program. And that sort of gets into you, Ben, and about responding to these subpoena sweeps and exams, because even though some people may look and say, well, they're laying off all of these people, there's probably not going to be as much activity. But I think as Mark and Brittain have both like laid out very well, there's still a big agenda, and they're going to need excuse the term, bodies to enforce that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in terms of sort of the nuts and bolts of the investigations?
So I think you're right, Ernie, that the investigations are still happening despite all of the news media about the government shutdown. Obviously, they're investigating things that are priorities for this administration, for this SEC. SEC just released its new agenda for where it's going in its rulemaking, and I think that's telling about where it will go in enforcement priorities as well. It's a lot of back to basics, like Mark said. It's a lot of waste, fraud, and abuse. It's a lot of lying, cheating, and stealing. So that's what they're looking at. And of course, they have several tools to get there when they start investigating any kind of regulated entity or person.
And what do you think? You know what's interesting? It's doing this for as long as we've all been doing it. It's amazing that you still see this happen a lot. But what do you see that firms in particular in the financial service industry, what are they doing? And let's lay it on the table. What are they doing wrong when they respond to SEC or DOJ subpoenas?
In a company that's in a highly regulated space, like I would say this is, I think a common misstep is thinking this is just business as usual. Every single one of these is business as usual. I get it. You might get a lot of subpoenas or a lot of regulatory inquiries in the area that you work, but it should not be taken as business as usual. You shouldn't necessarily use company counsel that you've always used that set up the firm, did all the articles of incorporation or what have you. You should get an experienced lawyer in this area. You shouldn't think that the request is ordinary. Perhaps the government's investigating something. Just by receiving the request, the government's asserting that the information they're requesting is relevant to an inquiry. And so you should take note of that. You shouldn't assume that everything is usual and that nothing is wrong. It could be that they're looking for something specific that is happening within the company or within the firm. And you shouldn't assume that everything is usual insofar as nothing can go wrong. I mean, you can produce something or say something in the investigation or inquiry that maybe that's not the subject of the investigation, but all of a sudden SEC has this now, and that does become the subject of a further investigation. So it's really that you can never be too careful. It is not business as usual. None of this is business as usual.
No, I think that's a great point. And Mark, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. Comment.
Just because Ben was making a really good point, is it okay just for 2 seconds? I think one of the biggest mistakes that everyone makes, and you can't just pin this on the financial service industry, is everyone thinks they can read the tea leaves in terms of what is in a CID, what is in a subpoena, what is it that they're looking for. And the only thing I can ever say is do not fall into that category, because more often than not, even with a trained eye, someone who just, someone who came out of the SEC like you, Ernie, someone who came out of the DOJ like us, someone who's been doing this for years all across the country and in many states like Ben, you think but you never know what any one individual thing is. And trust me, when any of these requests come in, it's going to be very broad and very big. And you, like Ben said, you can't just use the small shop that set up your company, maybe your GC. You really need experienced people in there to make sure that they're interacting with the regulators the way the regulators would expect, that they're asking the right questions to sort of help not just make it let's try to, read the tea leaves, is what they're asking for here, to make it an actually informed decision on what they might want, and to maybe get certain concessions out of whatever regulator it is. So I think really to re-emphasize what Ben said, that couldn't be more correct. And it's the biggest mistake we see on a daily basis by either involving someone too late or involving the wrong people.
Mark, it's absolutely on point what both you and Ben are saying. It literally just recently, a client of mine got this overbroad grand jury subpoena from the Eastern District of New York. I pick up the phone and call the FBI agent about it, who's listed on it. And I immediately start to say, is my client a subject, target, or witness in this investigation? And he cuts me off and he goes, "Counselor, we've already indicted the person we want. We need these documents for the trial." And it's just like music to my ears and music to my client's ears. But when my client first received the subpoena, they literally had a heart attack. They thought that they were under investigation and they didn't know. And it goes to the points that Mark and Ben are saying. And it also dovetails very nicely into another aspect that we're always asked about. Ben, the big C word. Where do you see the cooperation happening in this administration and in these investigations?
So cooperation, like true cooperation with the government, could involve obviously producing documents. It could involve cooperating by providing testimony, sitting down for a proffer, something like that, where you speak with the regulators or the prosecutors and say, this is what happened. So true cooperation is tied up in DOJ and SEC policies, and those change all the time. In fact, this administration released its cooperation guidelines a few months ago that we published about, because those are critical to what we do on a regular basis, advising companies on, or even individuals on how much do you want to cooperate. Cooperation is important because, from a corporate counsel perspective, it's important because you want to be forthright when you can. If you're acting uncooperative and you have no problems, or at least the investigation has shown no problems, acting uncooperative can raise government suspicion unnecessarily. And so putting someone like us in between the regulators and the company is a good idea in that instance, so we can kind of field that down and make sure that everyone understands what's going on.
Right. And before we get to like cooperation and remediation and things of that nature, let's focus in on cooperation on its most practical level in terms of the investigation, the examination, the sweep, and things like that. Is there ever a time, in your opinion, that you could step back and say to the government, no, we're not going to do this? Like, how would you go about doing that?
Well, it goes well into why you need someone in this position. You need to have somebody who has the relationship, the experience, and the rapport with the government. I'm thinking of a subpoena, like Mark said, they come in very broad, and that one request could cover hundreds of thousands of documents. And because we sit in a position between the company and the government, we can talk with the company and say, they're interested in this, it looks like, what can we do to satisfy them? And then we can take that to the government and say, look, this isn't going to happen the way you phrased it. What we can do is we can do this instead. We can provide a summary of this information, or we can get you a smaller scope of information. And so I'm hesitant to say that I would certainly sit here and say, no, you don't have to listen to the government if they institute, if they give you a specific request. But if a request makes the company uncertain about the time, the cost, the scope, or things like that, that's where I see opportunities to talk with investigators and regulators and say, look, I'm not trying to stop you from getting what you're getting. I'm just trying to make sure you get what you need, and my client isn't out, months and months and hundreds of thousands of dollars of work involved doing it.
And that's a great point, because sometimes when you're looking at this stuff and you get a semblance of what's out there from the client, you have to go back sometimes and you have to say, do you really want all of this? More than happy to give it to you, but do you really want it? I have another area that I want to get into when it comes to it, and I want to throw it open to all three of you, okay? And that's internal investigations. Now, we all love them when the government is not involved, okay? But what happens when the government is there and has already started either a subpoena, or the SEC or FINRA or the CFTC is there on an exam or something along those lines? Why don't we start with Brittain and go around the horn? Sound like an ESPN anchor right now, but
Sure. Reporting live from, no, I think it obviously changes the calculus. If you already know that the government has, let's say it's DOJ, if they've surfaced an investigation and this is news to, that the wrongdoing is at least news to the C-suite or, the decision makers, the most important thing you need to do is get your arms around what happened as fast as possible. And so you really need a team of attorneys specialized that can come in like a SWAT team, really, and capture all of the relevant communications. That's phones, that's emails, do, interviews, understand where the vulnerabilities are, see if you can, get to sort of a core understanding of the facts and know in advance, or at least be able to then reach out with some level of credibility to government of, trying to keep a cooperative posture, but also, not letting them know that you have not been, aware of this before. I mean, it's sort of a delicate dance. When you don't have the government involved, you have a little bit more luxury of time, and you can be more calculated about sort of what steps you take and so forth. But it really is all hands on deck when you've got to do an internal investigation and the government has just surfaced. It should not be the time to be using, typical counsel. You need to recognize that you're going to need to, there's going to be some pain at the in the cost factor, but it's worth it at the end, because you don't want, it's kind of a race, because maybe DOJ doesn't know the end game. Maybe you want to get in front of the narrative too. Maybe they've got it wrong. So there's really just no trading on putting the bodies on the case, putting the time in, the resources as soon as possible, because it will pay off in spades down the way.
Mark, what do you think? Do you think that there's ever an opportunity to get it done right, before the DOJ or the SEC or CFTC come down hard?
Before they, so there's two scenarios here, I think we're still sticking with, they've shown up and they're just, basically ransacking the place, for lack of a better word, right? I think, for kind of like Brittain said, when you're triaging these things, you need to find out quickly, okay, who has the information? What do we represent them? If we don't represent them, is it going to be that the company's paying for their lawyers, and we need to get them lawyers that we know and that we trust and that are going to do that? I think that's a huge priority when you have a couple dozen federal agents running around a building and just trying to talk to people, and then just making sure too that these employees know what their rights are without telling them what to do, or saying that they won't. There's fine lines when you don't represent them, but letting them know what their rights are okay, right? And then just trying to quickly, as Brittain said, triaging this and getting all of the information so that you can get your arms around it and get out ahead of the narrative. And that's something that we have to do regularly, because a lot of times you cannot stop the government enforcement action, whether it be a seizure, a search, or anything else. But in the right circumstances, there might be a time to come forward and give your own narrative up front, especially if you have a clear idea of what is happening. And you may or may not have that. But those are probably the most important things. And then you do want to start talking to the people that you do represent, understand exactly what's happening, making sure that that information is contained, and then you can start dealing with the government. Because a lot of times the government comes in there, and they do come in like gangbusters. Sometimes they're very good. Sometimes it's a little ad hoc, and they're just talking to people. They don't really know what they want. They don't know what they're looking for. And they might be more amenable to hey, look, we've already talked to 20 people. How about this? How about we give you an attorney proffer of what they say? How about we, maybe somebody might go for let's talk to you in the hypothetical, sort of, this is what you would likely find out. Maybe you can do that. Maybe you can control the situation, but you need folks that have done this before and that have been down that road, so that they know exactly what they're dealing with.
Mark, I really do hope, and I know it's difficult to gauge right now, I really do hope the current administration continues the policy of the last administration that really relied upon a lot of attorney proffers, at least from my experience. I hope that continues in this one. Ben, what do you think about this concept? When you're doing this, when you're dealing with this, and both Mark and Brittain have alluded to it, about this self-reporting thought, when you're dealing with this investigation, they're already there. Can you self-report is really sort of, I suppose, the first philosophical question.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the guidance from DOJ in the cooperation front and self-reporting is really, it hinges on what are you reporting? Are you coming clean on what we know, or are you reporting something new? And to understand that, you need to, of course, conduct this fulsome investigation that we've been talking about. And then, I mean, self-reporting itself, you have to consider a bunch of things, and every single case is different in this with this issue. You know, is it something that DOJ is investigating or SEC is investigating a specific person in the company, or is they investigating company-wide? Is there a publicly traded company involved, which of course comes with numerous issues relating to stockholders and the public, fraud on the public. So there's a lot of issues with self-reporting that have percolated, I guess, you know, as the administration turns over. So it's a case by case basis, but it's largely dependent on what are you self-reporting? Is it new? Is it old? And how confident are you that you've gotten to the bottom of the barrel in this investigation that Brittain and Mark have talked about?
And it sort of delves nicely into like what Ben just said into our next sort of topic. And we've already touched upon this in terms of cooperating on the practical level during the exam sweep subpoena, however it's presented. But Mark and Brittain, you guys just left the DOJ, okay? And a lot of people want to know what the DOJ really means by cooperation. What credit? What are they expecting you to do? And Brittain, like, what steps would you advise financial services industry firms to take to sort of maximize cooperation credit, if that's even possible?
Sure. Well, there's a bunch to unpack there. I mean, I think that, you know, in terms of maximizing cooperation credit for DOJ, when they say complete and full cooperation, they mean it. And so, you know, this is depending on what stage your investigation is in, you know, that will look somewhat different. But at the end of the day, it is to, you know, basically as a company or, you know, an entity, you would be wanting to, you know, provide them with, you know, any culpable individuals, you know, and everything supporting that culpability. You want to be documenting all the steps that you've done to investigate the wrongdoing, documenting how you're putting in place remediation efforts. It's going to be full and complete access to whatever they want. And so, you know, the advice is, one, you know, you need to have experienced counsel to deal with this, but two, prepare for it to be, you know, an extraordinarily searching inquiry. I don't know that there's any level of preparation. But that said, you can prepare in advance by at least making sure that you have excellent compliance, whistleblowing hotlines, that everything is actually works in practice. You know, it's not enough to say we have a hotline, but that nobody checks it but once a month. You know, DOJ is going to want to see that you were trying to be a good actor, and now that you're having to cooperate, that you're, you know, continuing in that regard.
And Mark, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, and Brittain really kind of covered the spectrum there. I would say the last thing that Brittain said is probably one of the most important, right? Because like cooperation, everybody kind of gets it, and like Brittain said, it is full, it is complete. It is not a, well, you know, like we can do this or we can help in that way. They're going to know, they know what buttons to press, they know what to ask for, and if they feel like you're slow rolling them, if they feel like you're not being forthcoming, if they feel like you're trying to unjustifiably obscure things or shade things, they're not going to like it. But far and away, the most important thing is compliance. And I think all of the agencies, more and more in the last 5 years or so, have scrutinized that. And you can't go without saying you have to have a robust compliant policy. It has to work. You have to be able to say, we pressure tested it and we know it. I remember on a fairly large case that I worked on when I was in fraud, and this was a little different because they had to have a compliance monitor later. They entered into a DPA, but their report to us in the first few months was, our new compliance policy is great. It's fantastic. We haven't gotten a single report in 3 months. Everything's going well. And this is a large international company that makes like very big, dangerous things. And immediately the thought was, something's wrong with your compliance policy. There should at least be one person somewhere saying something. And sure enough, like the way that they had the reporting structured, no person in their right mind would have gone up the chain, because essentially you were telling your boss that your boss or his bosses or your coworkers were doing something wrong. So you got to be careful about how that compliance policy is structured. You have to update it, and you have to show whatever regulator is asking that, one, it's tailored to your needs, right? So an automotive company might have a very different compliance policy than a financial services company, than a drug company. And those are all different things, that it's tailored to your needs, it's tailored to where you're doing business, how you're doing business, and who you're doing business with, not just what business you're doing. So I think that is far and away one of the most important things for people to take away from this, is that compliance aspect of the cooperation, because a premium is placed on that.
But Mark, I want to play off something you just said about the example that you used where they put in this compliance program and nobody reported it, okay? So then what did the DOJ consider then to be effective remediation? I know you said they had a compliance monitor, but like what could you do? Like what could you offer, to make them say, oh yeah, this is effective?
In that case, well, so again, they had a compliance monitor. So the monitor's job was to sort of revamp that, right? And probably the biggest thing there was just, one, change the way that the information was reported to make it actually have the person reporting it understand that it is confidential, understand that any reasonable allegation will be investigated, and that it's not staying within a particular chain. One thing that you see too in the financial services industries is there would be some person that's in charge of both HR and in charge of the financial services stuff. And they'd all report to the same person. And that can be a problem, right? Like a lot of times you want to keep HR on its own separate track, because maybe that is who gets these types of complaints. And you don't want somebody to feel like, well, if I'm making a complaint to HR, I'm really making it to my boss who oversees all of this anyway too, right? So it's just little things like that might not be obvious at first that can make a big difference, and certainly are things that the government looks at.
Right. And Brittain, how would you go about, like, with these changes, with this remediation, how would you go about advising a company about documenting them to show, to demonstrate? And the word that I'm avoiding like the plague is the culture word. You know what I'm saying? That, I think has been used a lot over the last 10 years. Like you have to change the culture, because I think sometimes that may be overblown a little bit, unless you disagree with me. And that, but you still have to demonstrate to the regulator, DOJ, SEC, that you've done the right thing and you've remediated.
Right. I'm not a big fan of the culture word either. I think, again, it comes down to, audit trails and showing you, kind of like in math class in grade school, show your work, right? Document it, more than you think you need to. And, that'll go a long way, because then you have something that's, provable. And you can also use that to, on an ongoing basis to identify weak spots and so forth.
I'm laughing not at your answer. Your answer is perfect, but it reminded me of a very bad story. But when you document and everything in the securities industry, every registered person is supposed to reread the compliance manual every year as part of the annual assessment. What happened was this particular firm had it digitized, so everybody would go online and they would have to certify that they read it. And what ended up happening is when the SEC came in, and this is sort of what I was why I was laughing at what Brittain was saying about the audit trail. Well, there was an audit trail of everyone going on, and about the 100 or so people that worked in the company that were subject to this requirement. The SEC did a calculation, and they found out for about a 150-page manual, each person spent on average about 12 seconds. And
as long as it took to scroll down.
Scroll down, exactly. Completely defeating what was expected of them. So it's not only having that audit trail, but making sure that audit trail makes sense as well too. While we're waiting to get Brittain back and everything, let's sort of switch to sort of like, and I want to sort of begin with Ben on this. Ben, what do you see the next wave of scrutiny? And I'm going to throw out a couple of topics that a lot of people are interested in. AI data privacy, cybersecurity, or something else? What do you see out there happening in the future?
I mean, I think with respect to the financial services industry, like we're talking about today, I think cybersecurity is still a hot button issue. I think cybersecurity is broad enough that it covers holding PII. I think it also incorporates a little bit of AI, even with crypto kind of being, I won't say old hat, but crypto's been around for a little bit. And now that crypto is, like I said, part of that new SEC agenda, I think that's a little bit of cyber. And so I think cybersecurity is broad enough that you're going to see a lot of that. And I think that DOJ and SEC are expecting companies that have sophisticated networks and engage in this kind of thing to understand how to protect the stuff on a cyber network. And so I think that is, I think it's broad enough to give me safe haven here.
Mark, what do you think?
I certainly agree with everything that Ben just said. And maybe this just has something to do more with the news that I'm reading every day, which very well could be driven by the thing that I'm going to say, AI. Just because right, like there's just been so many questions about it. Just in terms of the ethical ways that it operates, but also, and I think it's really saying the same thing that Ben is, which is it involves a lot of data privacy. It involves a lot of cybersecurity, and so many other questions. You already see, like, little hints of various industries trying to regulate this. I think that is a good thing. The legal world is, judges are getting very cognizant of that. In the financial services sector, you're seeing a lot of scrutiny of it to make sure that your investment advisor isn't, giving you AI generated advice. And this is sort of crazy. As you get old, like me, you have to go to the doctor more often than you ever want to. And I'm going to my doctor, and it was like, telling him something about like some symptom. I was, like my elbow hurts and my arm too. The doctor was literally Googling, using some AI tool, what was wrong with me. And I was thinking to myself, I'm like, oh my God, like you guys should really think about having a compliance policy in here. Because if the world finds out that doctors are just using AI and Google to make diagnoses, hey, we're all in trouble. But I just see that as a field that's ripe for regulation. Now, the question is going to be, can the government do it? And can they keep up with the speed of technology? Because they've repeatedly proven that, there's usually a 5 to 10 year lag, Ernie, Ben?
Yep, that's right. And I just want to say one thing about Mark, to a caveat too, that also applies to people coming to see lawyers. One of the things I'm seeing is the look on AI. Well, AI told me A, B, and C. The problem is AI is not your lawyer, and they're usually wrong when they ask those things, when they say those things. So got to be careful about that as well too. Hi, Brittain, welcome back. Technology.
I was not offended by anything you say, I swear, Ernie. It's just pivoting here a little bit.
Brittain, since you're back, okay, can you tell us a little bit about we're into the home stretch. We're talking about what to expect into the future. One of the things I think is a great sort of model is preparation. What can you tell to the current legal teams and compliance teams at our clients and at our firms and the people online, how they can prepare for these future things that are going to happen?
Sure. Well, I think, one of the things, we tell most people is to have a plan, right? Imagine that everything's going to be great and wonderful, but have a plan that you're going to be under scrutiny. And so what that means is not waiting until you get a subpoena or grand jury subpoena, or even an FBI agent showing up at your door to, talk to experienced counsel about sort of best practices, get those moving, in terms of, whether it's record keeping, whether it's managing third party risk, whether it's, you know, reviews of even your brokers or whatever. Like, is there somebody that needs, some remedial stuff? Like, keep on top of all the risk points, and, bring in counsel to sort of help you spot those and do the work in advance. So at least you have, that you're looking at the right areas. And then number two, have a plan in place for if and when FBI shows up with a search warrant, know who to call. We do this. Mark and I have trained entities numerous times on not just responding to grand jury subpoenas and best practices, but what happens when a regulator casually shows up for a knock and talk. These are all things you can prepare for in advance, and will not be a huge investment of time, but are really will serve you down the road to have thought them through with experienced counsel.
Ben, what would you advise?
Yeah, I mean, what I was going to say before Brittain answered was talk to experienced lawyers before you think you need experienced lawyers. And that is exactly what she got at, which is, we get a lot of calls that's, oh my God, this just happened. And that's fine. We take those calls and we field those issues and we can fix the problems, or we can at least guide people down and advise people down. But it's the people who call ahead and say, I have an issue and I want to fix it before it goes bad. That's really where it's super effective to bring us in. Because getting to your self-reporting thing, maybe there's a self-report that needs to happen, or that can happen, or maybe we can, build a relationship with regulators and say, look, this company's doing the right thing over here. They brought us in to build this program from scratch or to help it come up to date, that kind of thing. So early engagement is important. It's what people often overlook, I think, when they're not under scrutiny or don't think they're under scrutiny. And I think that's where people can get better.
Hey, Mark, I'm going to use my power as the moderator to say, what's your take? And you can't say early engagement.
My take is, and I also know too that there's a number of folks on these calls that are not just from purely the financial services industry. Know who you're doing business with. Like when you're doing your due diligence, understand like who the people you're doing business with are doing business with. That's probably one of the best proactive steps that you can take. And even though you said I wasn't allowed to, I still agree with everything that Ben and Brittain said, because that is really important.
All right, last question. This has been great. Last question to all of you. We will go alphabetically. Ben, what's one piece of advice you would offer to people in the industry to get them ready for what's going to happen in the future?
Oh my goodness.
With enforcement, I should say.
Okay, you don't want me talking about finances. I would say one piece of advice to get ready for what's happening in the future is to understand systems fully. Don't have gaps in the technologies that you're using, or don't use a technology that at least someone knows fully what's going on with it. Don't just trust that it's working.
Right. Brittain?
I think one of my thoughts would be, know your data, know what the government can do with your data. It's certainly on the brokerage and trading side. DOJ is, really invested in data analytics, data analysis. So, and the SEC, of course, has done this with trading for a long time. There's more out there in the world of sort of data control. There's a DOJ program under the National Security Division, data protection, making sure that you're not off-sourcing it. But all of that still goes back to financial services folks, because it's a global world of finance. And so, whether it's cybersecurity, making sure you're not exporting your data to a place where you're not supposed to have it, knowing how to control it, those kind of things need to be top of mind. And then my one plug would be, from a firm perspective, have everybody have a company phone, not a personal phone for work. It just makes everything easier.
Yeah, totally does. Mark, no limitations. Your
All
thoughts?
right. No, I would say, I think this is good general advice. We've talked for almost an hour now about regulatory agendas, what various agencies are doing or not doing, or, maybe appear to be stepping back from. But just remember, don't ever take your foot off the gas in terms of making sure you're up to date, making sure that you're compliant, making sure that you're doing all the things that you would normally do. Because even if you are in an industry or a sector where you feel like there might be less enforcement right now, given a particular set of circumstances with an administration. It doesn't mean that state AGs are going to feel the same way. It doesn't mean that another government that you are somehow interacting with or regulated by is feeling the same way, or that another agency is even feeling the same way. And it certainly doesn't mean that 3.5, 4 years from now, when we are guaranteed, to have a different president, a different administration, that things won't revert back to the way they were. I know SEC Chair Atkins said we're going to try to future-proof some regulations, and that would be great. But you can't take anything for granted, take nothing for granted, and don't take your foot off the gas.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, when I heard him say that, I did chuckle, and I know you're not supposed to laugh at the chairman, but there is a Supreme Court decision called Jarchese versus the SEC that I'm not certain anybody can ever future-proof anything anymore. So with that, are there any questions from our audience? We really, really appreciate everything. Not seeing any questions. I want to thank everybody today. Thank our wonderful panel, Brittain, Mark, and Ben. You guys are wonderful. On behalf of Thompson, Hine, and our panelists, want to thank you for joining us today and hope you found today's discussion informative, and hopefully we'll see you at future sessions. We have one coming up on October 21st called RIA Deal Making, Strategy, Risk, and Readiness. That's our next coffee chat. You should watch your inbox. And I will just point out again, if you have any questions or would like information about the topic, please feel free to reach out to our panelists. Thanks again for attending, and enjoy the rest of the day.